Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria. And well, it's been an interesting week. Last week I made my big announcement about publishing the Book of Heavenly Voices in the not too distant future and inviting people to join my mailing list to be updated on that as well as some other things. And I've got to say, I am truly humbled by the response that I have got from people so far. It's a very generous number of people that have joined the mailing list so far. And if you're one of those people, I just want to say thank you so much for your support. And you're really helping to build something great by doing so. And if you haven't already joined the mailing list, I encourage you to do so. And perhaps after tonight's video, when you hear about some of the things, some of the messages that I'm trying to spread, you will want to join as well. But today's topic will give you a taste of the types of things that the angels told me about in the scrying sessions that would produce the knowledge that would become the Book of Heavenly Voices. And tonight's topic is, of course, the coming of the Messiah. And as the thumbnail says, the coming of the Messiah could be sooner than we think. It could actually happen in the next few weeks. That sounds like a sensational claim. But I'm not talking about a particular rabbi coming forth who fits the requirements, and I'm not talking about Jesus appearing in the sky and destroying the world, as some people have tried to predict. I'm talking about something much more realistic, but something which reflects a much deeper and more mystical understanding of the coming of the Messiah. So this subject matter touches upon a lot of different topics. So this is going to be a very in-depth video, quite long potentially, but every bit of information is going to be really worth your while. And this might even turn into a bit of a manifesto in terms of my vision for the future of humanity, based on the topics that I'm going to hit. So, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where I can be sitting here today, not a religious crackpot, I hope, and me saying that the coming of the Messiah is imminent and that all the signs are pointing towards it? Well, we are indeed living in very prophetic times, as I touched upon in my last video. In the last several decades, and in fact, particularly the last few years, we have seen multiple biblical prophecies being fulfilled in a quite stunning, literal way. And those prophecies themselves suggest that such events will be a sign that the end is near. The end of the present order of things and the arrival of the Messianic age. I've covered a bit about that in my previous video and the video that I made before that on the imminentizing of the eschaton, which is currently underway by very powerful interests. And so that brings me to another point, because a lot of things are happening which seem to be a literal fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It's not necessarily happening organically though. A lot of this is engineered. The wars, or at the very least the rhetoric that is used around certain wars, like the current conflict with Iran, the breeding of the red heifers, and things like that, is all manufactured, and it's all being undertaken by religious fundamentalists who want to artificially push humanity closer to Armageddon, closer to the coming of their Messiah, by deliberately fulfilling the prophecies. And so, to bring about their version of the second coming, a lot of very powerful interests are going to a lot of effort to manufacture an apocalypse. And so, given the amount of effort they've put in, it would be a real shame if somebody came along and hijacked the narrative that they've created about the coming of the Messiah and redirected the narrative instead towards the spiritual awakening of the human race. Gosh, it would be really, really annoying if something like that happened, wouldn't it? Stay tuned. And also, I just want to put this idea out there. Perhaps it is the fundamentalists who have hijacked the apocalyptic narrative. And what I'm going to be attempting to do tonight is to bring it back to something like what it was meant to be pointing towards before, the military, industrial, religious complex decided to twist it for its own ends. So as I've said, in some of my previous videos, I prefigured the topic of this video by saying certain prophecies seem to be fulfilled or in the process of being fulfilled in our time. And this points towards the imminent arrival of the Messiah as like the culmination of the prophetic period that we're living through now. The coming of the Messiah or the return of the Messiah, depending on what your particular beliefs are. And a lot of people think about this fulfillment of prophecy in the world today that is being alleged, and they think that it's mad. They think that it's just Bronze Age superstitions, that it's just religious nonsense, and that we shouldn't take it too seriously. But I put to you that the prophecies about the Messiah coming soon are in fact true. Perhaps it's more than a simple coincidence or manufacturing of the immanentizing of the eschaton that can account for the fact that the prophecies are being fulfilled so accurately. But perhaps along the way we have misunderstood and misinterpreted the real understanding of the fulfillment of those prophecies, and so turned them into something ridiculous. And perhaps now we need to rediscover how we are truly meant to understand those prophecies, at least the end point of those prophecies. In my last video, I promised to give you a sample of some of the contents of the Voces Caelesti, the Book of Heavenly Voices that I'm releasing soon. And, well, one of the mysteries that it claims to solve in the communications that are included in that book is the true meaning of the coming of the Messiah. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. This is going to be a very ambitious video that will essentially be introducing a new divinely inspired Christology that offers answers about the coming of the Messiah that deviate significantly from traditional Christian or Jewish beliefs. So that is the view of the coming of the Messiah that I'm sharing with you now. The first question we have to ask is this: is the imminent coming of the Messiah a coming in the proper sense, or is it simply the return of Jesus? So let's examine that first. When we think about the coming of the Messiah, we first have to, of course, establish who exactly we're talking about. Christians will say that Jesus was clearly the fulfillment of the biblical prophecies concerning the Messiah. Jews will say that Jesus did not and could not have fulfilled the Messianic prophecies, therefore the real Messiah must be yet to arrive. And I've looked at this from every angle. I was considering all of these questions and the contradictory accounts of whether this or that is fulfilled years ago. And I was grappling with these ideas and I couldn't come to a conclusion on my own. So I decided to do a Enochian scrying session. I reopened the highest level of the heavens corresponding to the 49th gate, the missing call, and I spoke with the beings that reside there. And I got some incredibly straightforward and simple answers. And suddenly the confusion that was in my head as I tried to think through these things was just dispelled instantly. And I had a beautiful new view of exactly how the coming of the Messiah would come about, which addressed some of the questions that I had, but just resolved them perfectly. And so this is the view of the coming of the Messiah that has made its way into the Voces Caelesti with the rest of the communications. And it can be regarded as a third position. And I'll give you a quote in how the coming of the Messiah was summarized according to the beings of that highest heaven. Truly, the life and death of Yeshua fulfilled much of the coming of the Mashiach that cannot now be fulfilled by another. Yet, there is that which remains unfulfilled. So that's the quote. Yeshua fulfilled much, but there is much which remains unfulfilled. So what exactly does that mean? Let's unpack that. So the first part of the communication is that much that Jesus did cannot now be fulfilled by another in fulfilling the prophecies of the Messiah. I could give many examples of that, but I only need one powerful example to illustrate my point. So one of the things that the Messiah is supposed to do is be a light to the Gentiles. The Messiah is supposed to be the one who brings the light of Torah and Torah study to the world of the Gentiles. And of course, that's happened now. It hadn't happened before Jesus' time, but since the coming of Jesus and the establishment of the church and the missionizing of the church throughout the Gentile world and the spreading of the Bible, including the Old Testament and the first 5 books of the Old Testament, now, because of Jesus, the Gentile world knows about the Torah, knows about God's law. And that's something that cannot be fulfilled by somebody else. You can't make the world unlearn Torah. The seal is broken, so to speak. And so who could that prophecy be referring to except for Jesus? But then we have the seeming contradiction. There is that which remains unfulfilled. If you ask a Jewish rabbi, they will be quick to point out that the prophecy of the end times lays out a few specific things that are supposed to happen close to or because of the coming of the Messiah. One of those is the ingathering of the exiles, meaning the ingathering of all the people of Israel back to their homeland. Not just the tribe of Judah, but also the lost 10 tribes of Israel as well. That hadn't happened in Jesus' time. There had been returns from exile, but not all the tribes. Expectation of the war of Gog and Magog, that was supposed to happen just before the final victory of the Messiah, and so on. So a rabbi will point to all of that and say, see, it couldn't have been Jesus. But we'll look at these unfulfilled prophecies a bit later, and so we'll come back to them. But for now, I want to look at what does it mean if Jesus partially fulfilled the Messianic prophecies, but there's that which remains unfulfilled. Does it mean that there's a second Messiah? Does it mean that a resurrected Jesus will come back and fulfill the rest of them? Does it mean something more esoteric and mystical than that, perhaps? This is the question that we need to answer. And in order to answer that question, I think the best authority is Jesus himself. So, although I'm going to be littering revelations that I received from the Voces Caelesti throughout this video, I'm not going to just expect you to believe it because, an angel told me. I'm going to be backing everything up with actually analyzing symbols, analyzing different versions of the life and teachings of Jesus to reach my conclusion. So, the first thing that I want to put to you is that to answer the question about how the unfulfilled prophecies are going to be fulfilled is to look to Jesus himself. Why do I say that? Well, because as has been demonstrated with my previous example, nobody came as close as Jesus to fulfilling the prophecies of the Messiah. And nobody else can come to fulfill the prophecies that he fulfilled. And so who better to authoritatively answer questions about the future coming of the Messiah than the person who has done the most to bring those prophecies to fulfillment, who has understood them the most from the inside out by virtue of living them and experiencing them. So we need to look to Jesus. Does that mean that we should all just convert to Christianity and follow the teachings of the church? No. Hold on one second. That's not what it means. It's not that simple. Because when you research the person of Jesus and what he most likely actually believed, and the legacy that he left behind, you discover that the teachings of Christ and the teachings of the church are two very, very separate things. There's a whole lot of ways that the church has changed and redacted Christ's teachings. For one thing, they excluded certain gospels from the Bible, most notably the Gnostic gospels. Some of those choices made more sense than others. For example, the infancy gospel of Thomas is probably excluded for pretty good reason. But the point is, there are things that Jesus is purported to have said that weren't included in the Bible and actually give some extra important information. You've got the fact that the church seems to ignore or downplay the versions of Christianity by those who knew him, such as James the Just, the brother of Jesus, in favor of the writings of people like St. Paul, who never knew Jesus and yet comes along with this version of Jesus' life that is completely different to what people like James taught, and introduces all of these foreign concepts that look more like Greco-Roman paganism than anything the historical Jesus would have actually taught. And even the earliest Gospels were post-Paul and influenced by Paul, that is to say the canonical Gospels. So that poses a bit of a problem for the authenticity of those texts as an account of the life of Christ. And then, of course, you've got all of the doctrines and dogmas that the church came up with, which have nothing to do with what's in the Bible at all. So, for example, the idea of hell as a place of eternal punishment, the idea of purgatory, the idea of Mary as the perpetual virgin. That's BS. We know that she had lots of children by natural means, and James was one of them. And this idea of a virgin birth, based on a mistranslation of the Hebrew word aima, which just means a young woman. The concept of the Antichrist as like this final boss at the end of time, who is a personification of all the evil in the world that the returned Christ has to fight, doesn't appear in the Bible. It's something that was developed later. I've got a whole video on that. This idea of replacement theology or supersessionism, which says that even though the Bible says that God's covenant with Israel is eternal, that somehow God has rejected Israel and now only the church is the true Israel. Again, something that has no basis in the Bible at all. The Assumption of Mary, something else that the church made up. The idea that we should have a day of rest on Sunday instead of Saturday, something that the church just made up. And just so you know that I'm not picking on Catholicism, the idea of the rapture, another ridiculous idea which doesn't appear in the Bible, that some Christians just made up along the way. And the list goes on. So somehow in the midst of this mess, we need to determine what Jesus truly taught. And to do that, we need to consider all the sources, and the ones that are most persuasive, disregarding teachings that obviously contradict what we can logically deduce would have been the sort of thing that Jesus would have taught, and try and move from there to determine what the true teachings of Jesus were, specifically in this instance on his coming again. So let's turn first to the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Although the veracity of the canonical Gospels has been disputed or contradicted by other Gospels in early church history or other groups, and even though they're heavily influenced by the theology of Paul, who was not an eyewitness to the life of Christ, they are nonetheless widely accepted as the most authoritative of the Gospels. And this is mainly due to the fact that they are quite early. And the only Gospel that I can think of that potentially has sources that are earlier or around the same time as the canonical Gospels is Thomas. There may be others, but that's the one that I'm familiar with. But let's for a moment consider the canonical Gospels as the most authoritative account of the life and teachings of Christ and see what they say about the second coming, so-called. So the most notable verse that we can look to is Matthew 24, verse 30, which is part of the Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus describes what will happen at the end. He describes how the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed. And then he says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And Jesus goes on to say, with reference to the coming of the Son of Man, together with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." The generation that was alive during Jesus' ministry, of course. A generation being roughly 40 years in biblical reckoning. So already we've got a huge clue that helps us narrow things down. Whatever this return of Christ was supposed to be, it must have already happened within a generation of Jesus. And actually, if you look at the signs, they do indicate that the spiritual coming again of Jesus already happened in that time period. There was the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. And in the years surrounding that, there was the appearance of a sword star in the heavens, a star which appeared like a cross, like a crucifix shape, in what would today be considered a UAP event over Jerusalem. And this is seen by some people as the sign of the Son of Man that was to be expected. A sign that the Son of Man was indeed, in that time, coming on the clouds of heaven. And heaven here, of course, is not correctly understood as a physical place in the sky, but rather a spiritual state of existence. And apparitions in the sky can point us towards that, but it's ultimately a spiritual state of existence that we're talking about. And that's why Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you in Luke 17, verse 21. So there's this spiritual coming again that happened within Jesus' own generation. And we can learn more about it by reading the Gospel of John. In John chapter 14, verses 2 to 3, Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." The Father's house is, of course, heaven. The heavenly realm, the heavenly state of existence, the spiritual state of existence. And then John 14:19 goes on to say, "Before long, the world will not see me anymore, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. On that day, you will realize," this is verse 20 now, "on that day you will realize that I am in my Father and you are in me and I am in you. You will enter the place where I am, where my Father is, by me entering you and you entering me, in that place with the Father where I am." What seems to be described here is an inner process whereby the Christ returns within the person who follows Christ at a spiritual level somehow. It's a return within that person's own being. And this is just the canonical Gospels. There's nothing Gnostic about any of this. But then the Gospel of Thomas backs this up with saying 108, in which Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become like me, and I will become that one, and hidden things will be revealed to him." So, again, Jesus or Christ and the person following his teaching is becoming one and the same. Drinks from my mouth, follows my teachings, integrates my teachings into their life to become just like me. Okay, but there was certain stuff that was unfulfilled in biblical prophecy and remained unfulfilled long after Jesus' own time. And although Jesus, when he said all these things will happen, was referring to specific prophecies that he gave on the Mount of Olives, the full coming of the Messiah in triumph had to happen after some other things were fulfilled, which had not been fulfilled in Jesus' time, but actually seem to be in the process of being fulfilled now, interestingly enough. So then, if this coming of Jesus in the Spirit already happened, but the second coming clearly hasn't happened yet, how can we explain this contradiction? Well, the Vocis Caelesti provides an answer to that as well, saying, quote, "How is it that the Christos can come in spirit when he is said to have been here from the resurrection until now? It is because Yeshua Christos has not truly been known in spirit. Listen now. Unless the people should know the true reason why Yeshua was the Saviour, and unless they should know the true reason for his identity with the Father and with the Son of Man, then the people have not truly known him." And it goes on to say, "And Christ shall spiritually return again into the world when the true nature of his teachings is restored, together with the true teachings on his nature." End quote. So the Christ already returned in the first century, but we failed to recognize that return, and so we failed to go up and meet him. And so we couldn't complete the process. We didn't do our bit to complete the process of his return, but he's been there waiting for us in the spirit this whole time, waiting for us to come to that realization again, when certain knowledge is no longer repressed by the mainstream church. And that's the time that we're living in today. And it's very interesting that the time when Israel was re-established as a nation, and in the words of dispensationalists, restarted the prophecy clock, that at that same time we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts, which gave us a better understanding of what may indeed be the true teachings of Christ. But hold that thought. We need to understand the true teachings of Christ and the true nature of Christ, and then we can internalize that as Christ instructed us to, and then Christ will be with us. Then the Christ will return in some way. Right, so now we're getting somewhere interesting. But there's still a lot to unpack. What are Christ's true teachings is the first question we have to ask. The nature of his teachings, the first part of that phrase that I received. And there's really two dimensions to this. To summarize the contents of that part of the Vocis Caelesti, there's two parts to this. One is this idea of the coming of the Christ within us, and the other is the social gospel of the Christ. So let's look at the first one first, the coming of the Christ within us. This is where the Gnostic Gospels really come in handy, and the Gnostic texts really come in handy because they really flesh out this process of inner self-knowledge and inner transformation, whereby we discover that we are a divine spark, that we belong in heaven, and we shed all of the things that keep us held to our earthly existence to once again become divinized beings, as indeed Jesus himself did, and follow his example and undergo the very same process of becoming a divine being that Jesus underwent. And this is all an internal spiritual process that's going on, which is very much in keeping with what Jesus is describing in his teachings. And in the Gnostic view, we must not simply wait for some kind of vicarious atonement, for relying on Jesus' sacrifice of himself to save us from this or that, but rather it's up to us to put the teachings into practice, to follow Jesus' example, to win salvation for ourselves. It gives us a lot more agency. It leaves it up to the individual. It doesn't leave us reliant on some other sacrifice or some priesthood who gatekeeps salvation. And I think that's important as well to this whole process. I think if you look at the way that Jesus treated the religious authorities of his own day, that's much more what he had in mind than setting up a new Pharisaical priesthood, which is what much of the church behaves like quite often. And so we already know what the process that Jesus was referring to is for discovering the spiritualized Christ, for allowing that Christ to be born within ourselves and to become like that Christ and to become that Christ. We already have that information available, and we have had it in some form this whole time. It just had to go deep underground because of the persecutions of the mainstream church against any form of heresy, what they deemed to be heresy. But they've always been around, but the Gnostic alternative view of Christianity really became popularized and entered mass consciousness in the 1940s and beyond with the discovery and translation of the Nag Hammadi library. And this is how Gnosticism really entered popular consciousness. And so that's something that has only happened very recently in the span of human history, of centuries and millennia. But even there, the process of rediscovering Jesus' true teachings was not complete, because this discovery of the Gnostic Gospels set up some of its own unhelpful falsehoods. So, for example, the way the Gnostic Gospels often get spoken about by those who accept them as alternative accounts of the teachings of Christ is that these Gnostic Gospels, these Gnostic teachings are the true teachings of Jesus, and that the evil church suppressed them to keep us all ignorant of the truth and keep us enslaved. And there is an element of truth to that. But it's not quite as black and white as that, because the Gnostic texts were not right about everything regarding the true nature of Christ and what he came here to teach. And we can tell that from reconstructing the life of Christ based on his own beliefs in his own region and what he must have been teaching. And the work of James Tabor is particularly instructive in this regard. Very good academic research into the authentic teachings of the Christ, if you're ever interested in that. In particular, the Gnostic Gospels are very escapist. They have a very negative view of the material world and see the process of salvation as something wholly spiritual. We need to leave the physical world and return to heaven. Our soul needs to escape the clutches of the archons that are in control of this world. Whereas what Jesus would have actually believed would have been something much closer to traditional Judaism. And indeed, this is indicated by the way he speaks in the Gospels, that what Jesus foresaw was not escaping the material world, but transforming the material world. He would have seen the material world as part of God's creation, but that it contained darkness and it contained sin, but in the last days it would be transformed into something holier than what it currently is. And so rather than escaping of the material world, there's this transformation of the material world to infuse it with divinity, to infuse it with heavenly light. And that's really what Jesus was actually teaching. And yet people who talk about this alternative mystical Christianity still are very allergic to the material world and acknowledging the material world. So the small number of people who do practice some form of Gnosticism, who have tried to put things like the Pistis Sophia into practice, still have this aversion to the physical world, are not interested in worldly affairs at all. They just try and ignore the world. And even people in alternative spiritual spaces who talk about Christ consciousness, which is a version of this idea, albeit superficially understood, they tend to be people with this kind of annoying, solipsistic, New Age boomer type of spirituality, where it's all about, I'm going to change my consciousness, I'm going to elevate my consciousness to Christ consciousness, but I don't care about the world, I don't care about the injustices that are going on in the world, and I don't want to think about them because I can't fix them anyway, and it'll just make me upset and angry, and that's all negative emotion. And what I'm trying to do is raise my vibration to more positive emotions like love. So I don't really care about the problems of the world for that reason. All I can do is change myself, and I don't care about anything else. And that's the kind of spirituality that they have. But that's not what Jesus came here to establish. He came here to make the last first and the first last. He came here to confront the injustices of the world and to undo them. And so what we really need to do is we need to not only understand the mystical side of Christ's teachings, the inner transformation, but we need to combine that with an understanding of the social change that Jesus was calling for as well. Because at the moment, you don't really see those two things together. So that brings us to the social gospel. And as I've covered, Jesus was Jewish. He believed in the Jewish end time scenario where the world was transformed to be more godly and more holy in the Messianic era, where the kingdoms of the world would be defeated and a new order put in place that was centered around God, and in particular centered around the Davidic king Messiah from Jerusalem, who Jesus saw himself as. And so it would be a transformed and divinized world, very much a political program of social change, but human beings would also, in addition to this, come to inhabit these glorified bodies or these resurrection bodies of the world to come. Which, compare that to the Gnostic idea about transforming yourself spiritually until you gain the vestment of light. Perhaps a similar idea. But it is combined with this social transformation as well. Again, James Tabor's research into this is very instructive. And this is the position of the Ebionites as well. who are closest to the teachings of James the Just, who was probably meant to be Jesus' successor as his brother, and so next in line in the Davidic dynasty. And so the Ebionites taught that the Messianic kingdom needs to be brought about physically by a particular individual or his followers. And this is the view that is held by Jews even today. But it's actually evolved since then. Particularly Reform Jews no longer expect an individual Messiah, but they expect the arrival of a Messianic era, which is brought about by multiple people. It's kind of like a collective of people who participate in this arrival of the Messianic era. And it comes from this idea that the Old Testament doesn't actually say there's only one Messiah. Actually, there's several people who are Messiahs. It just means an anointed one of God. And so perhaps many people in the last days are anointed to participate in this collective movement to bring about the Messianic era, because we all contain the spark of Messiah within us, which is something I'll get to in more detail later as well. And so it's given rise to this idea in modern Reform Judaism of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, of being inspired by the fact that we contain the spark of Messiah within us, and therefore it's our responsibility to help bring the Messianic age about, to then participate in trying to make the world a more just and righteous place. And, there are some versions of Christianity which have a social gospel which echo these sentiments, but it's quite rare, to be honest. A lot of mainstream Christianity is just focused on the hereafter, of getting into heaven, which is never something that Jesus taught. What he taught was that we have to make this world better, that we need to repair this world. And so that is the teaching that needs to be restored in these latter days. There is one thing that I think is a weakness of the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, of the modern Reform Jewish idea, which is that if you want to bring about the Messianic age and you want to behave as an individual in a way that is going to bring about the Messianic era, then as human beings, we really need a person who can be a role model. We need somebody who can serve as an individual example and personify an ideal as to how exactly we will behave in a way that we can be that kind of influence in the world. And I think that Jesus is the perfect example of that. And so that's the piece that is missing to really turn this into something where we can start to understand how to bring about Messiah in our own lives, in our own world. And if we look carefully at prophecy, what we seem to get is a Messiah coming first as an individual, and then the focus shifting from an individual to an ideal, perhaps that is embodied by an individual, but perhaps which is embodied by more than one person as well. So we see that the Messiah needs to be a descendant of King David. And then we get this prophecy that the Messiah will accomplish this or that, and then that the seed of David will sit on the throne forever, an eternal dynasty. And so if you think about it, everything that is of the world perishes. There is not a single worldly dynasty of kings and queens that will last forever. Not one. Not even the Davidic dynasty. The longest standing royal dynasty in the world is the Japanese royal family, but even that dynasty will come to an end one day. And so the only way that a royal dynasty can last forever is if one person from that line becomes eternal in some way, transforms themselves to become everlasting, which is exactly what Jesus is said to have done through his transformation into something divine. And then you get this Son of Man figure as well in the book of Daniel and the book of 1 Enoch, which seems to be pointing to a similar idea of like a human figure, but one that is in the divine realm, one that is elevated to the heavens, and is almost like an archetypal idea, a symbol rather than an individual. And so that's where the narrative seems to move towards, and that is where the prophecies seem to be moving towards. Which brings me to the second part of this video, which is the teachings on his nature. What we need to understand about the nature of Christ to fully understand the path of enabling the return of Christ to happen in the world. To really understand the nature of Christ in greater depth, we need to understand one symbol in particular, and that is the symbol of the Son of Man. More than any other phrase, this is how Jesus describes himself in the Gospels when he is returning, when he is coming again. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So what exactly is this Son of Man? And the question of what is the Son of Man is not something that has a straightforward answer or definition. It takes you down a whole rabbit hole of religious and spiritual speculation. So, in spite of what we've come to believe about the Son of Man, that it's just a euphemism for Jesus or the Messiah, what it originally probably meant, and this again is relying on the work of James Tabor, is that the Son of Man was a symbol of a group of people rather than one person, a sort of faithful remnant in the end times who were given authority by God to bring about the Messianic age. In modern terms, this is similar to, the critical mass of people who create a global shift in consciousness or mass spiritual awakening. I suppose you could say it's a similar concept to that. Perhaps even those ideas were inspired by this faithful remnant idea from the Bible. So we have a group of people who have followed the teachings of Christ and internalized them, who then go out into the world and fulfill something else. That's the Son of Man. But that's not the only interpretation of the Son of Man. The term Son of Man is associated with Daniel's vision in the book of Daniel. But before that, the phrase Son of Man actually came from an earlier text, which is the first book of Enoch. Another one which didn't make the cut, either in the Jewish or the Christian Bible, but is a very important spiritual text. And the Son of Man is associated with this kind of heavenly Redeemer figure in the book of 1 Enoch. And elsewhere, this mysterious figure, the Son of Man, has legitimately been associated with the individual person who is the Messiah. But it gets more mysterious even than that, because in the book of 1 Enoch, the Son of Man is associated with Enoch, and in 3 Enoch, the Son of Man is associated with Metatron, who is of course Enoch after he has been taken up into heaven and transformed into an angel. And Metatron is also given the title the Lesser Yahweh, which is very interesting. So we have in the Son of Man one symbol which unites a whole number of disparate ideas. An individual human being, the idea of a human being who ascends into heaven and becomes divinized, a higher spiritual being, and a faithful remnant. And it seems to be all of those things interchangeably. That's what the Son of Man is. So, when we combine all of that, and we combine that with what we have already learnt about how Jesus most likely imagined that his return would be, what we have in the Son of Man is a prophet, specifically Jesus, who ascends into heaven to become one with a pre-existent spiritual being, whether that's God or some other power, and who in so doing shows the way for others to follow his example to become one with him, and therefore with this same pre-existent being, and then go out into the world and be the source of positive change, which ultimately brings about the Messianic Era. And this is how the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. This idea is reinforced by some other ideas that we can find in the Kabbalah and in Hasidic Judaism, whereby the Messiah is indeed a pre-existent spiritual being, but not just any pre-existent spiritual being, but the collective soul of the human race. Or to use the terminology of the Kabbalah and their division of the parts of the soul, Messiah is the Yechidah of collective humanity. And therefore, the Yechidah in each and every individual human being is one and the same with the Messiah. You could say that that is their own inner manifestation of the Messiah, is that person's deepest soul. And so by embodying this deepest level of the soul fully within ourselves, we become a physical manifestation of that Messiah. And perhaps this is what Jesus himself did, and perhaps this is what Jesus calls us to do as well, in fulfilling the prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man. Another point I'd like to make here is that the reason why the Jews did not include the books of Enoch in their holy scriptures is because of this lesser Yahweh. The idea of a lesser Yahweh seems to be pointing to a second power in heaven, which is the highest blasphemy. Because of course the number one rule of Judaism is that there is only one God. God is one. Jews say that 3 times a day when they pray. It's a central tenet of Judaism. And so to have a lesser Yahweh suggests that there's a second power in heaven. And so we need to grapple with this. If we're saying that Jesus wouldn't have taught anything which would have been completely beyond the pale for a religious Jew in first century Judea, we need to explain this somehow. And I think the way that you explain it is by seeing this lesser Yahweh, this other power that sits at the right hand of the Father, not as a separate being at all, but as one emanation of a God that is indeed one. In the same way that the Sephirot of the Tree of Life all emanate from one God, the way that the Hindu deities all are mere emanations of one God, Brahman. And that's how you resolve the contradiction. And so that's one thing that I think that the mainstream church did get right when they created their little innovation of the Trinity, because the rest of the symbols and the rest of the story can't make sense any other way. And then the prophecies of Zechariah cannot be fulfilled unless the Messiah is in some sense one with God, because it says that the Lord will stand upon the Mount of Olives to play the role that helps to usher in the coming of the Messianic Era. So there's that as well. And so considering all that, we know, as the Vocis Caelesti says, the reason for Jesus' identity with the Father and with the Son of Man. And so we can understand the true Christ, finally. Some of that comes through looking at the original teachings of the Christ. Some of that can be inferred by looking at the symbols and what they're actually saying and looking deeply into them. But what does this mean? Does this mean that everybody who wants to be a part of the Son of Man collective will need to go through the same initiations that Jesus went through and reach the same level of initiation that Jesus reached before they can go out and change the world? Well, if that were to happen, then there'd only be a very, very small number of people who would actually be a part of the Son of Man. Not nearly the number of people that you would need for a mass awakening of humanity. So I think that what needs to happen when we finally have the true understanding of what the Christ is that we need to then acknowledge that the Spirit of the Christ can motivate people in lots of different ways. And we all have that level of soul within us. And there's lots of different ways that we can get in touch with soul and allow soul to move us. And that really is how the Spirit of the Christ will work through most people with the coming of the Son of Man. And then, as the Vocis Caelesti says, the people shall become as a new temple of God. The Son of Man shall appear on the clouds of heaven as the ideal of the divine humanity is restored. Then shall a remnant that is among the people go forth and fulfill the remainder of the prophecies. Thus shall all things be established. Okay, but this opens yet another can of worms. What are the rest of the prophecies? Well, of course, these are the remainder of the prophecies to do with the coming of the Messianic Era that remain unfulfilled up until the present time, or are in the process of being fulfilled, to be more exact. So there's the war of Gog and Magog, which is just a final war before the arrival of the Messiah, quite possibly happening right now in the form of the present hostilities between Iran and Israel and the US, and I would argue Russia, although they're trying to hide the fact that they're involved. But what are the other big remaining prophecies that need to be fulfilled before the arrival of the Messianic era? Well, there's really four big ones. There's the ingathering of the exiles. This is all from the Bible. The rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The reinstating of the observance of God's law in Israel and actually the rest of the world. And finally, peace among the nations. World peace. Who wouldn't want that? And as I was making this video, I had a chance to consider each of these prophecies, and I had a bit of a breakthrough in my understanding, which I didn't have before, which was that the parts of these prophecies that remain unfulfilled are really the most spiritual parts of them, and are really all going to be accomplished by the same means, which is a return to an understanding of the spiritual and its importance in society, and particularly within ourselves. So let me demonstrate that now. The first one is the ingathering of the exiles. This is something which started to be literally fulfilled in 1947-48, when the state of Israel was re-established in quite an unprecedented way. But it's not just the ingathering of the tribe of Judah that's happening, but also the rediscovery of the lost 10 tribes is starting to occur as well. We had the discovery of the tribe of Dan in the form of Beta Israel in Ethiopia in the 80s. And now there are groups which claim descent from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are found in South Asia. So for the first time in history, we're actually starting to relocate the legendary lost 10 tribes. So that's something that's happening as well. And then in addition to that, there are the ones who were lost, who lost their sense of identity, who are now being found, such as the ones from Sepharad, a reference to the Spanish conversos. So the return of the conversos is another part of the prophecy that was needed, which is now being fulfilled as more and more people of that background realize where they really came from and have some kind of a desire to return to the religion of their ancestors. But all of this is things happening in the material world. But in fact, the exile cannot end until there is an end to the spiritual exile that the people of Israel now find themselves in, which means that they need to return to God. Which brings us to the second of the four prophecies, the reinstating of the observance of God's law. And these prophecies concern the affairs of the nation of Israel. But in fact, the whole world gets swept up in the fulfillment of these prophecies as well. A spiritual turning towards God among non-Jews as well as Jews, and a reinstating of the observance of God's law among Jews and non-Jews. But turning to Israel for a moment, so we've got the re-establishment of the state of Israel, but the ruling ideology of Israel has been secular Zionism. It may use religious justifications for its goals, but it actually has nothing to do with God. It's a secular nationalist ideology, and in fact many of its justifications for its actions are antithetical to God's laws. So for example, we had Netanyahu standing up recently talking about how Jesus has no advantage over Genghis Khan, and basically saying that evil will triumph over good unless good becomes evil, because only the strongest will survive, and you need to be cruel and vicious and violent and wicked in order to get by in this world. Trying to justify his kind of approach to world affairs. But that couldn't be further from what God was trying to establish when he established the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel was meant to be a light to the nations, to show that there's more to life than just dog eat dog, that we can actually elevate ourselves and to a higher moral standard as we become centered on God, which is beyond this world, and not just the petty concerns of this world. But now the younger generation in Israel are actually turning towards religion and towards spirituality. If you look at the kinds of music that is trending in Israel at the moment is basically like religious music, celebrating devotion to God. And so we see this reaction against what people like Netanyahu represent. And so there is this turning towards God as the center of all life. And this is something that's going to be worldwide. It's not just about Israel. The rebuilding of the temple, if this were to be fulfilled just in the material sense, I mean, it's going to cause a lot of problems. You know, it means the Dome of the Rock has to be demolished. And so to think about this simply as building a building is kind of missing the point. Actually, the final stage in the rebuilding of the temple is the descent of the presence of God into that temple, the Shekinah. And the Shekinah will not descend into the temple if there is evil going on and there's a misunderstanding of the point of temple worship. And that's happened before in the history of ancient Israel. So this is the final piece that the people that are trying to rebuild the temple now don't understand, because they have sided with people who believe that Jesus has no advantage over Genghis Khan and cannot understand why it would be otherwise. But the true completion of the final temple is going to be the restoring of our relationship with God, the descent of the Shekinah, the presence of God within our midst. And that includes the building of the temple in our own being. And this is the more elevated teaching of the rebuilding of the temple. I've spoken in a previous video about another revelation that I had, which is that the temple, the tabernacle, is the tree of life. And so it is actually a picture of the microcosm. So to fulfill the rebuilding of the temple at the most elevated level, we need to have the presence of God enter into us, which is exactly what I've just been talking about with the process that Jesus went through, that we need to follow in following Jesus' authentic teachings. And so it all follows on from this process that I outlined earlier in the video, the way that the remaining prophecies can be fulfilled. And then that leads me to the last one, which is peace among the nations. Well, in spite of all of the negativity in the media, you know, in modern history, we've gotten pretty close to the scenario that is described as the Messianic Era in the Bible, because of the Western liberal international order that has been established. We are living in the most peaceful time in all of human history, although it doesn't seem like it. Things were a lot more brutal in the past, a lot more brutal. And so we're working towards a goal, which is peace among the nations, which is achievable if you look at how far we've come already. To complete that goal, we need to understand what it is that has made us come this far. And once again, it comes down to understanding how God is at the center of everything. Let me explain. So the rules-based order, which is quickly disintegrating as we speak, but has created a peaceful and prosperous time in human history up until now. This regime of civil rights and human rights and the rule of law, it came from somewhere. And yes, it came from the Western liberal tradition, but we need to go a bit further than that. Because if we take these ideas, these beautiful ideas of rights for everybody at face value, they're just one set of ideas in the midst of other competing ideas. And there's no reason why we should believe in human rights rather than might makes right, rather than the kind of Netanyahu philosophy of international politics. And so we become political realists and moral relativists. And with all the evil in the world, this lofty idea of rights for all will quickly become unrealistic if we don't put in the effort to preserve it, and will be defeated. And so within the secular liberal view, which is predominant of the human rights regime, it's inherently unstable. It cannot justify itself, because for such a rights-based order to hold, to have any integrity, there must be a justification for that order that is grounded in some higher truth. A higher truth which objectively determines that we should aspire towards the good, and that we should have laws that reflect the good and the just, and don't just oppress people. And this is precisely the kind of metaphysical truth that the men who ultimately gave us our modern system of rights did believe in. If you trace it back to the early Western liberal thinkers, as much as the secular tradition tries to claim them as being part of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and all of that, they were at the very least deists, if not Christians. In any case, very heavily influenced by Christian morality and the idea of natural law, the idea that there was a divine order to things, that human law needed to respect. And so, expressed in religious terms, this higher truth that rights need to be grounded in can be expressed as believing in God and being in alignment with God's laws, being in alignment with the Torah, which at its highest, most elevated understanding is simply love. The famous Rabbi Hillel said that the whole of the Torah is to love your neighbor, and everything else is commentary. And this very much reflects what Jesus himself taught. So we need to understand what love is, we need to understand what radical compassion is, and we need to understand why that needs to form the basis of civilization. Not this secular, purely intellectual idea of law, something which comes not from the intellect, but from the depths of the soul, the very same soul that represents the Christ within, the very same soul that we need to reconnect with in order to bring about collectively the coming of the Son of Man. Although over a long-term scale, the influence of Christianity over civilization seems to be waning, and we seem to be losing sight of the importance of higher values to our civilization, we need to reinvigorate civilization with that same notion. We need to have a new spiritual revival which reminds us of that deeper spiritual level of reality and its importance to our understanding ourselves, but also society. And this new revival, this new movement needs to preach a social gospel, which in turn can inspire a new global peace movement to bring that aspiration of peace among the nations to its final conclusion. That is how we can replicate the success we've had so far, and that is how we can bring that prophecy to its completion at long last. And I think it is important to appreciate how far we have come, because the influence of what is today called cultural Christianity really has moved us closer than ever before to the Messianic Era. Another proof that Jesus, more than any other person, did fulfill the prophecies of the Messiah. Although he said the kingdom of God would arrive in his lifetime, in his generation, and people say that it didn't, and therefore all the things that Jesus said would be fulfilled on the Mount of Olives couldn't have happened, I again think that this is a misconception, because the kingdom of God was established when Jesus established his church. And it's just that it's taken a long time for those ideas to spread and reform civilization that we haven't noticed it. But God doesn't operate according to days or weeks or years, but thousands of years. And so that initial moment of the arrival of the kingdom was only the beginning of a process that needed to unfold to reach its final climax. And that's what we're working towards in this period of history. And so there's just a little bit further to go before the coming of the Messiah, before the coming of the Son of Man, before the arrival of the Messianic era. But we can't afford to wait. We have to be the ones who are the change. We have to be the ones who bring it about. And the first step in doing that is understanding exactly what the teachings of that era are supposed to be, which is something that I've demonstrated tonight, I hope. At least this is what has been revealed to me. And so the true understanding of the purpose of Jesus' teachings and the coming of the Christ, it has to happen eventually, and it has to be restored eventually. And it has to inspire people towards creating the conditions of the Messianic era eventually, which aren't dissimilar from our own time, but there's peace, there's a true enduring peace in the world. That all has to happen. And me presenting the Voces Caelesti to the world is an attempt to set in motion the chain of events that will lead to that happening. And that might seem ambitious, it might even seem grandiose, but we have to try. We have to at least try to do what we can to bring this about. The coming of the Messiah is something that we are all responsible for. And if there's something that we can do to try and help that to happen, why wouldn't we do that? For the sake of the peanut gallery saying that we're megalomaniacs. I think we do what we can, and that's what I will be doing when I publish the Voces Caelesti and teach people about what it contains. And I may or may not be successful, but at least somebody tried to do something. Because we can't wait for somebody to save us. It really is up to us. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to encourage others to do. And that's what I mean when I say it could be a matter of weeks before the return of the Christ actually occurs. If you like what I'm doing here, I invite you to join my mailing list. I've tried to reach out to as many people as I can on YouTube, but to really do what I need to do, I need you to join the mailing list. There are people in control of Silicon Valley who hate Christ and will deliberately bury videos that talk about Christ. So this video will not get as far as it needs to go on YouTube. I need to have my own platform that I can control, that I can talk to you by directly without algorithms getting between us. And that's what the purpose of the mailing list is. So if you haven't joined already, there will be a link in the description below for you to be able to do that, to find out when the Voces Caelesti is published and other things that I do in the future. But what the hell, like and subscribe as well. It kind of helps me, but not nearly as much as it should. Anyway, thanks for your support however you do it, and leave any comments you have down below. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.